Greetings, warm welcomes, fellow seekers of the truth that's out there. It's always good to be among you, in sunshine and in shadow, all you critically thinking souls. It's a new departure for us all, as of now, contemplating a journey together to explore strangeness, to contemplate that which is inexplicable, but that has undeniably been genuinely experienced by so many people. Mysteries, frights, just general spookiness and a sense of something strange. How our reality seems sometimes penetrated or permeated with dimensions elsewhere. Before we get into it, can I just give you a quick reminder to check out my patreon.com site. As always, it's by joining the site, parting with a bit of cash, that you support this podcast and all the various things that we seek to do here, and it's support in a real and practical sense. It's about the price of a cup of coffee every month, and in return you get early access to all my new content and exclusive access to the question and answer session and the occasional competition and other little oddities. It's great. Join up, stir yourself into the mix, and thereby make it even better. To get the ball rolling, to open the door on this, as I've said before, but it's probably worth saying again, when I first thought of writing a book with this subject matter in mind, my dad was alive. But by the time I was actually on the point of writing anything down, rather than just thinking about it, my dad had died. And so I wrote the book in the aftermath of losing my dad. And inevitably, that frame of mind is shot through the piece, because he was always on my mind in relation to every story, because he had recently himself become one of the departed. And the first story, as it happens, in the book, is one that is touched by the relationship between fathers and sons, specifically the relationship between a father and a son. The story's set, the first story is set, the first haunting is in a place called Sandwood Bay, which is on Cape Wrath in the northern western corner of Scotland. And Cape Wrath, for a start, for me is an infinitely evocative name. We obviously think of wrath in terms of the 7 deadly sins, great anger. But in actual fact, the wrath in this context really comes from the Norse. It's Viking. It's a corruption of a Norse word that means a turning or a corner. And for ships, for men in the long ships, either going back towards Scandinavia from wherever they'd been off the west coast of Britain, Scotland, or moving in the other direction, coming along the top of Scotland and turning down towards the west, it was their point of turning. Hence Cape Wrath. So it is to this day an emptiness, Cape Wrath. It's largely unpopulated. I mean, the far north of Scotland is relatively free of people anyway, but go up to Cape Wrath and spend some time up there and you can get properly away from the madding crowd up there. It's, by some estimates, it's one of the last wildernesses in the British Isles. Cape Wrath. And there's an appropriately isolated bay in Cape Wrath called Sandwood Bay. Again, Sandwood there is affected by the Norse. It's really it's a Norse name that means sandy water. Water that's thick with suspended motes of sand. And Sandwood Bay in Cape Wrath is undoubtedly justifiably described as being haunted by stories, if nothing else. For want of people in the immediate vicinity, the place is haunted by stories. All sorts. The sorts of things, if you've got any kind of familiarity with that part of the world, the sort of associations that you would make. So there's stories of Spanish gold. It's well known that the Spanish Armada, 1588, was scattered by a storm, actually on the east coast of Britain. And then those that survived the initial storm had to take the long way home, all the way around the top of Scotland, down the west coast of Ireland, before, if they were lucky enough and if they survived long enough, making it back to Spain. But along the way, a lot of the ships were wrecked. A lot of the Armada vessels came to grief. And so there's various locations around the west and the northwest of Scotland. There are stories that the ships that went down had treasure chests of gold and coins and bullion and jewellery and all of the rest of it. So there's all sorts of stories of lost treasure. There's stories of lost love. There's stories of couples that came together in a place like Sandwood Bay and were then pulled apart by fate. But their stories remembered nonetheless. And there are always stories of lost men. Men lost to shipwreck, men drowned, and their spirits, their wraiths, lingering, haunting the nearest landfall. And in Sandwood Bay, there's a preponderance of stories about men always alone who seem to be displeased. They're in search of something, or they're displeased by whoever they encounter, because whoever they encounter, travellers, locals, are not the people sought. And so the encounter never seems to go particularly well. There's always a disappointment at the very least, if not a displeasure at who's found. And there's a particular story that I'll come to, but it's in my head now at the beginning of the story, so I'll as I've already mentioned, it's to do with a lost father and son. A father and son, the crew of a little family fishing boat, and they are lost. And they are subsequently found drowned and dead on Sandwood Bay, and bound together by a rope that they had tied around themselves, around each other, as a storm began to get the better of their vessel. And I am haunted by the thought of them because of all the unknowable details. What's the explanation? Were they determined to be found together, dead or alive? Was that their final intention? Maybe the intention of the father. And I think about once they were bound together and separated from the vessel, who drowned first? Who gave up the ghost first? And who, for his last moments, was bound to the other, already lost? And I think about, I've had many years of contemplating people who live on the coast. I'm known to some as the coast guy on account of my years making a documentary television series of the same name. So I had a lot of time to contemplate the lives of communities based around fishing. And fisher folk they live especially close to death, because it was and remains amongst the most perilous professions. To go out into the sundering sea in search of the sea's harvest is especially dangerous. And I think about how in the old days the fishermen didn't swim. They just generally didn't learn to swim, which sounds like a strange option given the nature of the work. But the idea was that fishermen who couldn't swim were more committed to the welfare of the boat. If the boat was your only hope, then looking after the boat, tending the boat, keeping the boat afloat was your number one priority, because you didn't want to go in the water. And always as well, there's the suspicion, not without grounds, amongst fisher people, that depending on where they come to grief, some places are more dangerous than others. Specifically, if they come ashore where the people are farmers, there was a suspicion that farmers would be less kind to them than would be other fisher folk. The sympathy wasn't there. And there are all these traditions, north, south, east and west, particularly around Cornwall as it happens, of wreckers, of false lights being set to lure ships onto rocks so that the cargo could be taken, and of stragglers making it to beaches being put to death, so that there would be no witnesses to the crime. So there are so many thoughts around a story like The Father and Son in Sandwood Bay on Cape Wrath. If you go to Sandwood Bay, a mile or so southwest of the bay itself is a watchman. In Gaelic, he's Ambuchel, which is the shepherd. And what Ambuchel is a sea stack of Torridonian sandstone. You know, one of these things that's been isolated from a cliff by erosion, so you get this tall chimney of rock all alone. In the case of the Sentinel, close by or relatively close to Sandwood Bay, it's Ambuchel. It's revered. He is revered by climbers, those madmen and women that want to go and ascend these unstable looking natural features. And to get to Ambuchel, you have to swim. You have to wait for low tide, and even then there's water, 30 yards. You swim out, cold water, it's always cold, get on the plinth, and then contemplate the climb. But if you turn round, if you're on Ambuchel and you turn and look in the right direction, you can make out a pale, sometimes pink, sometimes gold, depends on the light, a bay, a beach, and this is Sandwood Bay. So really, from whatever angle you contemplate Sandwood Bay, it's always remote. Most people now will go by car, but the closest a car will bring you is a little hamlet, a little wide spot in the road called Blairmore by Kinloch Bervie. And when you park up, you have to walk, it's about 3-4 miles, along a path across brackish moorland, actually, pretty bleak, treeless. So for the most part, there's not even birdsong. It can be very quiet, it can be quite oppressive. Nothing above you but the sky. The path, year round, it can often be flooded, so you've got to pick your way through it. There's eventually at one point when you're kind of closing in on Sandwood Bay, there are tall dunes, and behind the dunes is Loch Sandwood, and it's a loch thick with trout, and on its northern shoreline, on the shoreline of Sandwood Loch, there's a shell of a cottage called Sandwood Cottage. And it's true of the walk across the moor to Sandwood Bay, which is, by the time you get to Sandwood Bay, you're on the rim of the North Atlantic Ocean. It's the edge of the edge. And by the time you get there, you've walked past other abandoned buildings, because the Highland clearances, that most people have heard about, saw to the emptying of that landscape, the emptying of people who were farmers, to be replaced by flocks of sheep that were more profitable. And so all these buildings, all these houses are roofless by and large, and they're like giant planters really for trees that grow inside them, rowans and so on, and other shrubs and overgrowth. And there's a sadness about the path to Sandwood Bay. There's an absence and what you're feeling is the absence of the people that were there once. A landscape that was cleared deliberately of people who wanted to remain, but were chased away nonetheless. And a landscape can't mourn people, but there's a feeling of unfinished business, uncompleted sentences, conversations cut short by fate and time. There's a long history in that landscape, a long history of people. There were Picts at Sandwood. That's the painted people that the Romans wrote about and clashed with. Well, they met them further south, but the same people covered in body paint or tattoos, nobody's quite clear. And the Picts, well, they're mysterious to this day, but one way or another probably descended from the same hunters who repopulated Britain, the Long Island of Britain, and therefore Scotland in the north, as the Ice Age, waxed and waned 10, 12,000 years ago. So the Picts had the place to themselves for the longest time, whatever they called themselves. Then they were joined, happily or not, by Scots from Ireland. Scots seems to be a word that, well, there's lots of etymologies around Scots, but it might mean something like seaborne pirates, which gives an indication of Picts seeing the Scots arrive from the sea. There were Vikings, obviously, at Sandwood Bay, hence the name Sandwood, hence the name Cape Wrath. On a place like Cape Wrath, on the edge of the world, it's a fact that many hands have sort of, groped and grasped for a hold, coming and going somewhere to elsewhere, making that turning at Cape Wrath. There were often uncountable occasions when ships came to grief. So, fishing boats, cargo ships, Spanish galleons, Viking longships, Philip's Armada, 1588, sent to hell by God, or at least that's the way you look on it if you were an English Christian. He blew with his winds and they were scattered, goes the account. And some of the lost ended up buried in Sandwood Bay. That's a fact. Bodies were routinely found on the bay, and they were hauled up above the high water mark and buried in the sand dunes. The writer Seton Gordon wrote an account of Sandwood Bay when there were still wooden shipwrecks on it, where the carcasses of wrecked ships were still there to be seen. All of them are old tragedies, he wrote, almost buried in the sand, far above the reach of the highest tide. And so, in a place like that, it's no surprise, really, to find stories of lost men. Surprisingly, though, not all the stories are about men. In the first year of the 20th century, 1901, a shepherd by the name of Alexander Gunn, he came onto Sandwood Bay because one of his flock was lost. And he came in with one of his sheepdogs, and they were looking around just to see if the beast was on the beach. And his dog suddenly dropped at his feet and started whimpering, as though it was aware of something that it didn't like. And when the shepherd Gunn followed the dog's line of sight, when he looked where he was looking, on a flat rock, just proud of the sea, there was a shape. And he thought at first it had to be a seal, but then he realised it wasn't a seal, it was a woman. A real big woman, maybe as much as 7 feet tall, blonde hair, dark with wetness. For all that, a beauty, an Amazonian figure, sallow skin, green eyes. And right up until his death in 1944, so not so very long ago, Alexander Gunn was insisting that what he and his dog encountered on Sandwood Bay was a mermaid. So it's a strange place, and it attracts strange stories. There have been all manner of sightings of unexpected things at Sandwood Bay, and most of them concern sailors, men who appear to be dressed as though they have just come from fishing boats or sailing boats. There's always something about scale. The men, it's always a man alone. They're always big, 6.5 feet tall, 7 feet tall. There's always something about scale, not unlike the scale of the mermaid. They're always wearing classic sailor garb, reefer jackets, hats, heavy boots, this kind of thing. There's a story that's often recounted in the vicinity of Sandwood Bay by those that still remember, of an Australian man who came to Sandwood Bay and fell in love with a local girl. But for some days or weeks they were seen walking together on the beach, and then life and fate took him away on the promise that he would return. But by the time he returned, the woman was no longer there. Life had taken her elsewhere, and his wraith is one of those that's supposed to be encountered by those that walk the strand at Sandwood Bay. There's more, actually, in the way of hauntings around the ruined cottage that I mentioned that's on the northern shore of Sandwood Loch. People encounter men alone, almost always seen at a distance. There's another writer, Peter Underwood, who was in the habit of writing about ghostly encounters, and he, amongst many others, described a night spent in the ruin of the cottage by two walkers. So as they're lying on the ground floor, separated from the space above by the first floor, they hear horses. They hear horses moving about on the floor above, stamping on the floorboards. And they go up, and the space is open to the sky, and there are no horses. Underwood was effectively a ghost hunter, and he also recorded an anecdote related to him by a woman living in Edinburgh who had never visited Sandwood, but had one way or another come into possession of a splinter of wood that was said to have come from the stairs, the wooden staircase in Sandwood Cottage. And she kept it in a little box. It was some kind of keepsake, some sort of souvenir that had been handed to her. And she had homes over the years in Edinburgh and in London, and she had inexplicable experiences in both. Heavy footsteps at night when she was alone, plates and cups thrown or dropped by invisible hands. One time in her Edinburgh home, she smelt pipe smoke and the aroma of whiskey. And when she turned to see where the smell was coming from, she came face to face with a great big sailor who looked her up and down and climbed out of a window. It's all strangeness at Sandwood Bay. It's a recurrent strangeness that begs an explanation. Cape Wrath Lighthouse was built in the parish of Durness by the legend that is Robert Stevenson. It cost £14,000 and it was lit for the first time on Christmas Day in 1828. It sits like 400 feet above the sea. It was paraffin at first, then mercury vapour, and finally it was plugged into the electric grid. And that was a significant event at Cape Wrath because it finally made that turning point, that corner, infinitely safer for mariners because they could get a sense of where the trouble lay. And so it brought to an end that period where ships had come to grief. But many are the bones of men buried in the sand dunes of Sandwood Bay. And it's undeniable that there's also a reported malevolence in that neck of the woods. Or if not malevolence, an absence of welcome, a sense of not being wanted. Now, I mentioned fathers and sons. Underwood recorded another father and son who were on the beach at Sandwood collecting driftwood for their home fire. And they had loaded up their pony with all this driftwood, when suddenly beside them there was a large bearded man, furious with them, pointing at the bundles of sticks. And he said, "Take your hands off what doesn't belong to you and leave my property." And they were completely taken aback, completely unnerved, not least by the fact that he seemed to have appeared beside them out of nowhere. And so they did as they were told, and they unloaded the wood and they hurried away. And it's interesting in the Scottish context that defence of property, upset at things being taken away, is often a recurrent theme of encounters with ghosts in that part of the world. On the Orkney island of Rousey in 1911, a farmer told anyone who would listen that he'd been digging into one of the burial mounds that Orkney and Rousey in particular are littered with. Rousey is known as a sort of a Valley of the Kings of the far north, such as the extent of the coverage of Neolithic archaeological sites. But in this instance, a farmer in 1911 was digging into the mound in search of building stone because he knew there'd be substantial stone within the structure. And while he was doing it, he realised that there was an old man standing beside him. Unfamiliar garb, strange clothes, a strange presence. And he said, and this is the way that he recounts what the old man said to him: "Thou art working thy own ruin, believe me, fellow, for if thou does any more work, thou will regret it when it's too late. Take my word, fellow, stop working in my house. For if thou doesn't, mark my word, fellow, if thou takes another shovelful, mark my word, thou will have 6 of thy cattle dying in the cornyard at any one time. And if thou goes on doing any more work, fellow, mark my word, then will you have 6 funerals from your house, fellow. Does thou mark my words? Good day, fellow." The guy just vanished. He's rattled. Our 1911 farmer's rattled, but he keeps on going. He's got work to do and structures to build. So he digs into the mound regardless and takes away the building stone. And accordingly, in the days that followed, half a dozen of his cattle died, and there were 6 funerals to organise for people close to him in due course. Over and over, there are reports, uneasy, disturbing stories in and around Sandwood. All manner of stories of stranded fishermen taking shelter in the cottage, shepherds, crofters, all experiencing noises, malevolent sensations of malevolence, a sense of being not welcome, faces at windows, faces in doorways, heavy footsteps on stairs that aren't even there anymore, and then, people moving about with candlelight trying to find the source of the upset and finding nothing, no more sleep to be had. And whoever the big man is, and essentially at Sandwood Bay, it's haunted by a large male figure, and he leaves no trace. People see him, usually at a distance, standing alone on the dunes, looking out to sea or looking inland, and often by the gable end of Sandwood Cottage. And there's another writer, Andrew Green, another ghost hunter as it happens, and he recorded a report in 1967, it's the year I was born as it happens, of 2 English women on holiday. And they're walking on Sandwood Bay and they look over towards the cottage and they spot a figure, a towering shape, standing by one wall, dressed like a sailor. Reefer jacket, striped jumper, hat, boots, the works. And one of them makes their way towards him. Say hello, see what he's about. But on reaching the cottage, there's nobody there, no footprints in the soft ground, no trace at all. And this is only a typical encounter of sighting the big man, moving towards him and finding nothing there. And I said at the beginning of this, the story that haunts me from Sandwood is a father and son. It's about reports well documented, of 3 fishing boats out of one of the Western Isles, and they get caught by a storm, 3 ships together. And as is their practice, they make their way into, some nook, some corner where they can take shelter from the worst of it. And then, for reasons unknown, in a lull, in a seeming improvement of the conditions, one of the boats puts its sails back up and begins to make a run for home. And it is and was the custom of fishermen that when one boat goes, they all go. They stay together. And so the other 2 follow it out. And then the storm comes back. It's worse than before. They're tossed around. Sails are shredded. And the little flotilla gets broken up inasmuch as one ship falls away out of sight. The skippers of the other 2 vessels see a light that turns out to be in the window of a house that's been kept up late by a woman going through childbirth. And on account of glimpsing that light, they're able to make their way to a temporary safe haven. The other vessel, the third vessel, the lone boat crewed by a father and son, a father and his 16-year-old boy, they're not so lucky. And their vessel is overwhelmed. And at some point before they get separated from the boat, they lash themselves together with a length of rope. Presumably the father taking care of the son and determined that he wouldn't lose his flesh and blood even in death. And I'm minded when I think about them in those circumstances of Dylan Thomas. Dusk is drowned forever until tomorrow. It is all at once night now. The lights of the lamps in the windows call back the day and the dead that have run away to sea. And so Sandwood Bay, like so many places around these islands, is haunted by stories. But more than by any other, I'm preoccupied by the father and the son. I'm preoccupied, father that I am, with what was going through the father's mind when he knew that all was about to be lost. And I'm haunted too, as a son, by the thought of what my father would have done in the circumstances. And so Sandwood Bay is a place to visit, and it can be a beautiful place, but it's not, I would suggest, a place necessarily to be taken lightly. There's a cargo of loss there, and I wonder at the extent to which there's some kind of unopened cargo of guilt. Over the years, people finding bodies on the bay, bodies on the beach, not knowing who they are, having no way of knowing who they are, and just quietly burying them behind the sand dunes, in the knowledge that somewhere there's a home, somewhere there's a family to which those individuals will not be returning, and there will be no explanation ever to be had for the everlasting absence. I think about the father and son at Sandwood Bay, and it's the haunting of Sandwood Bay that sets me out on this story of hauntings.